The morning she lost the coat was the morning she lost what remained of her composure. She had not meant to drop it. The coat had slipped from her arm as she reached to gather a hat box the footman had let fall, and the whole small disaster unfolded in that particular way disasters had of arriving in clusters, so that a simple errand became a public performance of dishevelment. The hat box rolled, the coat spread itself across the wet cobblestones, and Marianne Wells, widow of 1 year and 3 months, stood in the middle of Porthcawl Street, in a gown too thin for November, and a bonnet the wind was doing its best to unmoor, and thought, with a calm that had taken considerable practice to achieve, that it did not matter. None of it mattered. She had retrieved the hat box. She had smoothed her bonnet. She had looked around for the coat, and found it gone. Not lost to the cobblestones. Held. Someone had retrieved it from the street and was standing at the edge of the pavement with it folded across one arm, waiting. She did not know the man. She knew of him, as one knew of anyone of consequence in the county, the way one knew the shape of a mountain without having climbed it. The Earl of Renmore was 34, recently come into his title after his father's death the previous winter, and possessed of a face that the season had not yet decided what to make of. Not handsome in any conventional way the assembly room portraits celebrated. Something more contained than that. A jaw set as if it had arrived at its current position through an act of will rather than anatomy, and gray eyes that gave nothing away unless they chose to. He was giving nothing away now. He held the coat and waited. "I believe this is yours," he said. The words were level, without ceremony. A statement, not a question. Marianne crossed the pavement and took the coat from him. Their gloved hands did not quite touch. She said, "Thank you, my lord," and meant to be done with it, meant to walk the remaining 30 yards to the barouche and not think about this moment again. That was the discipline of widowhood. She completed each small task and did not permit the mind to dwell. She had been practicing it to considerable effect. But he did not step away. He looked down at the coat, which she had not yet managed to settle over her arm, and his expression shifted by a degree so small that a person not attending carefully would have missed it entirely. His gaze had caught on something in the coat's right pocket. The pocket gaped slightly, its lining visible, and inside the lining, if one were close enough to see it, was the dull gleam of gold. Marianne did not follow his gaze. She settled the coat over her arm and turned away. She was 3 steps toward the barouche when she understood that the pocket was not merely open, it was empty. She stopped. The ring was gone. There are some losses so precise in their cruelty that the body receives them before the mind does. Marianne stood on the pavement and did not breathe, and in that suspended moment understood that what she had put in the pocket that morning for safekeeping, the ring she had worn for 4 years and removed only because the band had grown loose, was no longer there. She had felt it with her fingers only that morning before leaving the cottage. The pocket was empty. The Earl of Renmore was standing behind her on the pavement. She turned back. He had not moved. In his palm, held out as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, was a plain gold band. Small. Worn smooth on one side. "It was in the pocket," he said. "It fell when the coat opened." Marianne took the ring without speaking. She was grateful for the bonnet's shadow. Her fingers did not shake. She had learned not to let them. "Thank you," she said again. And this time she meant something rather more than the word contained. She did not look at him again. She walked to the barouche, climbed inside, and drew the curtains before the tears arrived. She had not expected to see the Earl of Renmore again. Porthcawl was not large, but large enough that a widow of no particular standing and an earl recently come into his title occupied different portions of its social geography. The assembly rooms, the better quarters morning calls, the lending library, these were not her world. The market and the circulating library's lesser annex on Copper Lane were her world now, and she moved through them with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to want very little from the places she went. She had been the wife of Mr. Clement Wells, a solicitor of the middle sort, respected enough when living and considerably less so once his obligations became clear. He had left her the cottage on Tanner's Row, and nothing else. Unless one counted the debts to 3 creditors who had been remarkably prompt. The cottage remained once those were satisfied. The furniture was largely gone, sold through the autumn, until the rooms held only what no one would buy. The writing desk with the broken hinge, the single good chair, and the small watercolor of Falmouth Harbor that had hung in Clement's study, which Marianne had kept, because she could not bear to part with it. It was perhaps the only sentimental error she had permitted herself since his death. To the assembled widows and respectable wives of Porthcawl, she was, as Mrs. Cecily Penfold had put it at the draper's shop not 3 weeks past in a voice designed to carry, a woman whose situation must be considered quite hopeless, I fear. Mrs. Penfold had been speaking to her companion, Miss Dorothea Quine, but the sentiment had arrived at Marianne's side of the bolt of muslin with perfect clarity. Quite hopeless. Mrs. Penfold had not been cruel about it. She had been accurate, as she understood accuracy, which was to say that she had assessed the facts of Marianne's situation, found them wanting, and rendered her verdict with the brisk efficiency of a magistrate who has no personal enmity toward the accused. Marianne had purchased her muslin and departed. She did not think about the Earl of Renmore's gray eyes or the precision with which he had held the ring out to her. She did not think about the fact that he had noticed it at all, that while she had been managing her bonnet and her composure, he had looked into the pocket of a stranger's dropped coat and registered what was inside. She did not think about any of this because thinking about it served no purpose. She thought about it anyway. In the evenings, with the single candle lit and the ring back on her right hand, she thought about it with the pointless attention the mind devotes to things it has been instructed not to examine. The ring was Clement's mother's. He had placed it on her finger in the church at Bodmin 4 years and 7 months ago, and she had worn it through a marriage that had been, in its early portion, gentle and companionable, and in its later portion, frightening in a way she had not had the vocabulary to name while it was happening. Not violent, not cruel in any demonstrable way. Only frightening in the way a ship taking on water is frightening, slowly, and then all at once. She had loved him, she thought. She had certainly tried. She had kept the ring because it had been his mother's, and because selling it would have felt like selling the last thing she had consented to believe in. She carried it as a kind of private accounting. The Earl of Renmore had looked at it and said nothing, and held it out to her, and that was the whole of what had happened on Porthcawl Street. She would not assign it any meaning it did not possess. She was still assigning it meaning 3 days later when she encountered him again. Not on Porthcawl Street, in Griggs's lesser annex on Copper Lane, which she had not thought was a place earls frequented. He was standing at the shelf of geographical periodicals with a volume open in his hands and a slight frown that suggested it was not delivering what it had promised. He had not yet seen her. She could, conceivably, have retreated without being noticed. She did not retreat. She had not retreated from anything in this past year, and she was not going to begin now over a man who had simply been polite to her on the street. She went to the shelf she had come for, which was 3 sections to his left, and selected the volume she needed, and was turning to carry it to the attendant's desk when he looked up from the geographical periodical. "Miss Wells," he said. She had not expected him to know her name. She registered this surprise with care and said, "My lord," in the level tone she used for everyone she now dealt with. "Griggs does not stock the Northern surveys," he said, which she understood was a reference to the volume she was carrying, because she had taken the Southern Maritime Survey when she had wanted the Northern coastline accounts, and he had apparently noticed this too. "I am aware," she said. "The Southern Survey will serve." He looked at her with the gray eyes. "There is a Northern Survey at Renmore," he said, "if the coastline is what you need." She did not know what to say. It was the sort of offer that required context she did not have. "I am grateful," she said carefully, "but the Southern Survey will serve." And she paid Griggs's attendant and walked out without looking back, which cost her more effort than it should have. He did not follow her. She was not sure whether this was a relief. The ring sat on her right hand through all of this. She had taken to leaving her gloves off in the cottage because they were worn at the fingertips, and in the evenings she looked at the ring by firelight and thought about what a man who looked at pockets and noticed library holdings had made of her, standing on the street with a worn, smooth gold band and the whole visible machinery of her reduced situation on display. What she did not know then was that his steward fellows had mentioned, in passing the previous week, that the widow of Clement Wells was known to visit Griggs's annex on Tuesdays. He had filed this information with the care of a man who tells himself he is doing nothing with it, and then done something with it, and had stood at the periodicals shelf for the better part of an hour, feeling the particular frustration of a man who has done everything correctly and achieved nothing of use. He had not flinched either, on Porthcawl Street, when she had taken the ring back without looking at him. He had recognized the quality of what she was doing, that practiced composition, and it had cost him 3 days to understand why it stayed with him. He had been doing something similar for 2 years, since the morning he had found his younger brother Aldous at the foot of the stairs at Renmore, with a broken-backed letter in his hand and a stillness about him that had nothing to do with sleep. The letter had been from their father, written 6 months before his death, and never sent, and it had said the kinds of things that could not be unsaid, and Aldous had believed every word of it. Edmund Treverton, who had become the Earl of Renmore 6 months after that morning, and who had spent the intervening 2 years learning how to inhabit a title he had expected to occupy alongside a brother rather than in his absence, had also learned to compose himself in places where composition was required. The letter was in the drawer of his writing desk. He had not disposed of it because he was not yet certain whether disposing of it would make him feel better or worse. And until he was certain, he preferred to know where it was. He had not told anyone about the letter. He had not told anyone about Aldous. He had not told anyone about the letter. He had not told anyone about Aldous. He was not sure why the widow of a solicitor he had never met was the person he found himself wanting to tell, except that she had taken a ring from his hand without flinching and walked away. And he thought she might understand the particular discipline of carrying something that could not be put down. He mentioned to Colonel Hadwick that he was perhaps overdue for some society. The colonel, who had been at school with his father and felt himself licensed accordingly, mentioned that Mrs. Penfold was hosting a card party Friday, and that it was the sort of gathering where one encountered the counties respectably reduced, and that the widow of Clement Wells was known to attend. Edmund said he would consider it. He attended it. Marianne was standing at the far end of the Penfolds' drawing room when he arrived, holding a cup of tea she was not drinking, wearing a gown he recognized as the same one she had worn on Porthcawl Street, because he had noticed, that day, the way the gray wool had been mended at the left cuff, a small repair done with care, but in a thread that did not quite match. She was speaking with an elderly gentleman he did not know, and her face had the expression of careful attention she had directed at the shelves of Griggs's Annex. Present, contained, giving nothing particular away. She saw him. He knew this because her gaze crossed the room in the way gazes do in a crowded space, settling briefly on each new arrival, and it crossed him and did not stop. And then, a half-second later, returned. It was such a small thing. A half-second. He made his way around the room, speaking with the Colonel and nodding to Mrs. Penfold, and doing all the things expected of an earl at a card party, and eventually arrived at the window alcove where Mary Ann now stood alone. He did not manufacture a reason. He simply arrived. "Miss Wells," he said. "My lord," she said. And then, because she had the particular quality of honesty that dispensed with the social pretense when the social pretense was clearly a pretense, "I had not expected to see you here." "Nor I you," he said. He meant it as a statement of fact. He had expected to see her, but had not expected the seeing to feel as it did, which was like locating a landmark he had been navigating by without knowing it. She looked at him steadily. "Mrs. Penfold does not ordinarily invite earls to her card parties," she said. "No," he agreed. "She was persuaded by Colonel Hadwick, I think." Something shifted in her expression. She understood then what she had not understood before, and he watched her understand it, and did not look away. "The Northern Survey is still at Renmore," he said, because it seemed important to say something true. "If you have need of it." She was quiet for a moment. The card party moved around them, Mrs. Penfold's candles making warm pools on the figured carpet, the sound of card play and conversation doing what it always did, which was to create a kind of private silence in the middle of public noise. "My lord," she said carefully, "I do not know what you want." He had considered what he wanted and found that it resisted easy articulation, which was not his usual experience. He was, in most respects, a man who knew his own mind. "I want," he said, "to have a conversation that is not about the weather or the roads or the price of coal. I find they are in short supply." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Penfold has just told Lady Carne that my coat was seen last Tuesday on the floor of Griggs's Annex, and that one might draw one's own conclusions about a woman in reduced circumstances who could not manage a coat." He said nothing. He had not known this. "She has been saying similar things for 3 months," Mary Ann continued, in the same level tone. "And I have found that the supply of things she says is not likely to diminish. So if you are here because you felt some obligation after Porthcawl Street, I would ask you, with all the gratitude I can manage, to feel it for someone else." He looked at her with the gray eyes that gave nothing away and said, "I am not here because of obligation." She said, "Then I do not know why you are here." He said, "I am here because I find that I cannot quite stop thinking about a woman who stood on a cobblestone street and did not flinch." The silence that followed this was of the particular quality that cannot be manufactured. It had weight and warmth and something that was the opposite of emptiness. Mary Ann looked at the carpet. Then she looked back at him. Her expression had not changed, but something behind it had. Some small, closely held thing, releasing by a degree so small that no one not attending very closely would have seen it at all. "That is perhaps the strangest reason I have ever been offered," she said at last. "I expect it is," he said. If this was humor, it was the dry kind, the kind that does not announce itself. She said nothing further, but she did not move away. The card party continued around them, and Mrs. Penfold, at her station near the hearth, watched the Earl of Renmore standing in the window alcove with the widow of Clement Wells, and permitted herself a calculation that was, if she had known the full facts, considerably less accurate than she supposed. Stay with this story if it has found you where you are. There is more to come. The months between November and the following February were not, for Marianne, without incident. The Northern Survey did arrive from Renmore with a note so brief it could not be called a letter. Survey enclosed, as discussed. E.T. She sat with the note for an unreasonable amount of time before opening the survey, then sent it back with her own brevity. Received with thanks. M.W. She did not know why she felt the exchange was significant. She knew that it was. A second note came in December. Then a third. Each maintained the tone of a purely practical correspondence between neighbors with no emotional content whatsoever, and each one arrived with the specific weight of something she could not yet afford to name. Mrs. Penfold noticed. She remarked to Miss Quine in January at the Ladies' Benevolent Society that the Earl of Renmore appeared to be forming an unfortunate attachment. "The widow Wells," she said in the tone of a woman delivering a diagnosis, "is a woman with no money, no connections, and a history that can only be described as unfortunate. He will think better of it when Lady Treverton arrives." Miss Quine, who thought more than she said only, "Yes, I expect so," which she did not mean. The Dowager Countess did arrive in February, 2 weeks earlier than predicted, which was itself a message. She was a tall woman with Edmund's gray eyes and the bearing of a person who had spent 40 years being correct about most things and was not prepared to stop. She was not unkind. She was simply certain she was right. And her certainty was constructed from the same materials as the rest of the hierarchies: precedent, propriety, and the genuine belief that the order she had been handed was the correct one. She called on Marianne at the cottage on Tanner's Row 3 days after arriving in the county. This was not the visit of a woman checking the quality of Edmund's taste. It was the visit of a woman who had already assessed the situation and was delivering her assessment in person. The cottage was cold. The fire in the small sitting room had been burning since morning, but the walls held the damp of a February that had been unrelenting. And the single good chair was the best thing in the room. And Marianne had not lit the second candle because the second candle cost money, and she saw all of this through Lady Treverton's gray eyes and found it as uncomfortable as she had expected to find it. "I shall be plain," the Dowager Countess said, once the tea was poured, which it was, because Marianne had tea, and the pot, and the 2 cups that had survived the autumn's selling, and she was not going to fail in the basic courtesies of hospitality because her furniture was gone. "My son has been conducting a correspondence with you. We have exchanged a small number of notes regarding a survey of the coastal harbors," Marianne said, "of a purely practical nature." The Dowager Countess looked at her with the gray eyes. "A purely practical nature," she said, in the tone of a woman who has heard this particular explanation and found it insufficient every time. "My son has not exchanged a small number of notes with anyone in 2 years. He has not called on neighbors, or attended card parties, or conducted himself in any fashion except the most restricted one since his brother died. That he is conducting a correspondence with a woman of no means and a complicated history is not. Miss Wells, a matter of the coastal harbors." There it was, said plainly, because the Dowager Countess did plain when plain was what was needed. Marianne set her teacup down carefully. "I do not know what the Earl of Renmore intends," she said. "I have not presumed to know." "That is either very honest or very clever," the Dowager Countess said, "and I am not yet sure which." "It is honest," Marianne said. "I cannot afford to be clever." Something in the older woman's expression shifted. It was not the shift of approval exactly. It was the shift of a person encountering something she had not expected to encounter, and finding it inconvenient in its inconvenience. "You wore the ring today," the Dowager Countess said, which was not the observation Marianne had anticipated. "On your right hand." Marianne did not look at her hand. "Yes." "You know what it signals to put a wedding ring on the right hand." "I know what it signals," Marianne said, "and I did not intend to signal it. And yet there it is," the Dowager Countess said, not unkindly. There was a long pause. The fire crackled. The February rain made its particular sound against the cottage windows, which Marianne had patched with strips of cloth against the draught. "He lost a brother," the Dowager Countess said, more quietly. "He has not recovered. I do not think he knows how to recover. And I do not think that any woman, regardless of her qualities, can recover him. That is not the task of a wife. And I do not wish him to attach himself to the first woman who does not flinch in his presence, and find, 10 years hence, that he has simply exchanged one grief for another." Marianne looked at the Dowager Countess for a moment. Something passed between them that was not agreement and not disagreement, but perhaps recognition. Two women who had learned, by different routes, what it cost to be steadier than one felt. "I would not be that woman," Marianne said, "if that is what you fear." "I do not know yet what you are," the Dowager Countess said. She rose, which ended the visit, and pulled on her gloves, and paused at the door. "He is to accompany me to the Hadwick dinner on Thursday," she said. "As I expect you know. You have also been invited." She left without further comment. Marianne sat in the single good chair with the cold tea and the ring on her right hand, a woman of no means and a complicated history. She had been saying as much to herself since October, and found it no worse for being said aloud by someone else. She attended the Hadwick dinner. She wore the gray gown, pressed that morning, and her gloves, which covered the ring. She sat at the lower end of the table, between the colonel's daughter Fanny and a clergyman who spoke at length about the northern roads, and was content there. She had made her peace with the lower end of tables, which held more interesting conversation than the upper end, where the Dowager Countess sat with impeccable authority, and Lady Carne remarked on the difficulty of finding good domestics. Edmund sat across the table from her, not adjacent, which was itself a piece of social information. He had not arranged this. The Hadwick's table had arranged it. He looked at her twice across the soup course, both times with the gray eyes that gave nothing away, and she felt the looking with the specific awareness of someone who has been trying not to attend to something, and finding that not attending requires the same muscles as attending. "Do you sketch?" Fanny Hadwick asked her at the remove of the fish. "I used to," Marianne said. "I have been meaning to take it up again." "I should like to sketch the harbor works at Falmouth," Fanny said, "but Mamma says it is too great a distance." "It is not so far," Edmund said from across the table. He had been speaking to Lady Carne, but the conversation had found its way to his attention. "If one had a reliable party." There was a small silence across the table's lower end. Not the silence of impropriety, exactly. The silence of several people understanding simultaneously that something was being proposed that was not, technically, about a harbor. "Miss Hadwick," Marianne said, because she was not going to let a 17-year-old sit in that silence without rescue. "I believe your father intends to be in Falmouth in April for the Harbor Commission. You might apply to him." Fanny brightened. The conversation moved on, and Edmund's gaze came to rest on her face with the same quality it had had on Porthcawl Street, the quality of arriving at something it had been navigating toward without quite admitting the direction. Marianne felt it on the side of her face for the rest of the dinner, and did not look up. After dinner, in the drawing room, the Dowager Countess intercepted her between the door and the tea tray and said in a low voice that required no particular effort to keep from carrying, "You are kind to the girl." "She is easy to be kind to," Marianne said. "My son is watching you," the Dowager Countess said. "I am aware of it," Marianne said. "Are you afraid of it?" the Dowager Countess said. Marianne considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "I am not afraid of it. I am afraid of what comes after it." The Dowager Countess looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let Marianne reach the tea tray. What came after it was a Tuesday afternoon in March. With the spring beginning to assert itself against the county's February reluctance, Edmund Treverton called at the cottage on Tanner's Row without sending a note first, which was irregular, and without the cover of a social occasion to explain the call, which was also irregular. And Marianne opened the door herself because she could not afford a housemaid, and found him standing on her step with the Northern Survey under his arm, and a look on his face that suggested he had been intending to say something specific, and was now reassessing. "The survey," he said. "Yes," she said, and stepped back from the door to let him in. He came inside and stood in the small sitting room and did not look at any of it in the manner of a man cataloging a reduced situation. He looked at the watercolor. "Is that the Helford estuary?" he said. "Falmouth Harbor," she said. "My husband bought it from a traveling painter. It was the last thing we bought before he became ill." He set the survey on the writing desk and looked at the watercolor for a moment longer. Then he turned and looked at her, and she saw it. The thing the Dowager Countess had named without naming. The specific quality of a grief that had no ready address, that had been sitting in a man for 2 years, waiting to find somewhere to put itself. "I had a letter," he said. "From my father to my brother. It said things that could not be unsaid, and Aldous believed them. And I have been living in the neighborhood of that letter ever since, not sure what to do with it." She said nothing. She knew not to fill the space. "I keep it in the drawer of my desk," he said. "I tell myself I am keeping it, because I have not decided whether to burn it. I think the truth is I am keeping it, because burning it would feel like pretending the words were not said. And they were said. And my father is dead. And my brother is dead. And no one else in the county knows that both of those things happened on the same morning." The room was very quiet. The fire was lit, it being Tuesday afternoon, and she having allowed herself a fire on the afternoons, she went to Griggs's annex and came back. It was the smallest sort of comfort, and she defended it accordingly. "I know what it is," she said at last, "to live in the neighborhood of something that cannot be unmade. Not that. Not a letter. Something else. Something of a different shape. The quality of it, though. Of having to arrange your whole day around not walking into the room where the thing is." He looked at her. She had the impression that he was attending to her with the same totality he had brought to the pocket of the dropped coat. And this time, she did not look away. "Marianne," he said. It was the first time. Her given name in his voice, without prefix, without formality. A name arriving. Not a form of address. She felt it in the way one feels a door opening in a room one had come to believe was permanently sealed. She did not say anything. She put her hand out, not toward him, but palm up, in the space between them, which was a small space because the sitting room was not large, and he looked at her hand for a moment, and then he placed his own hand in it, gloved still, and she closed her fingers over the glove, and they stood like that for a moment that neither of them counted, because counting it would have required attending to something other than the specific rightness of the thing itself. "I cannot promise you anything easy," she said. "You know what the county believes about my situation." "I know what the county believes," he said. "I am not much governed by it." "Your mother is," she said. "My mother," he said, "told me last week that you were the most honest person she had met since my father died. She meant it as a warning. I received it as something else." There was a warmth in this, and something like the beginning of a smile in his eyes, which was a thing she had not seen before, and which cost him, she could tell, the specific effort of allowing it to be visible. "The ring," she said. "On my right hand. It was his mother's. Not his. I cannot tell you yet why I have kept it, except that it felt like something I owed to the woman who wore it before me, who did not know what her son would become." He looked at her hand, where the ring was under the glove she wore today, because she was going to the Hadwick dinner this evening and had no excuse not to wear the gloves. He said, "It does not need explaining." "I thought it did," she said. "No," he said simply. She thought she might tell him someday about the marriage that had been, in the end, a slow sort of drowning, and the year of crawling back to the surface, and what it had cost. He would listen, she thought, the way he had listened to her silence on Porthcawl Street, with the full attention of a man who understood that some things could not be hurried. "If you are still with Marianne at this hour, and I believe you are, you have been patient in the right way. Stay a little longer." The Hadwick dinner was the last dinner of the season, and it was also, though no one could have predicted this, the occasion for the ending of several arrangements that had been building across the winter. Mrs. Penfold arrived at the Hadwick dinner already in possession of the information that the Earl of Renmore had called at the cottage on Tanner's Row that afternoon, her footman having been in the vicinity, and reported back. She had communicated this to Lady Carne before the soup was finished, and by the time the party moved to the drawing-room, the information had resolved itself, as information did in such spaces, into a verdict. "A woman of quite no standing," she said to Lady Carne, in the tone of a woman confirming something both already know, "has managed to make herself necessary to a man who is perhaps too recently acquainted with loss to exercise the correct judgment. It happens." She fanned herself with the measured patience of a person who has been right for 40 years and expects to continue. "Lady Treverton will, of course, handle it." Lady Treverton was standing not far away. She had heard it, or the essential portion of it. Marianne had heard enough to understand the shape of what was being said, which was the same shape it had had at the Drapers in November and at every subsequent occasion. A woman of quite no standing. The sentence had not changed. It would not change for as long as she was in the vicinity to be described. Edmund was across the room. He had been speaking with Colonel Hadwick and one of the Falmouth Harbour Commissioners, and he had not heard Mrs. Penfold's assessment because the room was full enough to provide cover for precisely that kind of remark. He had been watching Marianne with the attention she now recognized, the quiet accumulation of it, and he looked across the room when he saw her expression shift, which it had done by an increment, barely visible. He crossed the room, not slowly, and not in the manner of a man making a social progress, but with the 3 strides of a man who had made a decision. He was standing in front of her. The room had not yet registered this. Mrs. Penfold's fan continued its measured arc. Lady Carne held her glass. "Marianne," he said, which was the second time he had used her name, and again it arrived without prefix or formality, in the middle of a room where the correct form was Miss Wells, and the room registered it, the small shocked intake that is not a sound, but a quality of attention. He did not speak to Mrs. Penfold. He did not look at Lady Carne. He looked at Marianne with the gray eyes that now, in this particular moment, gave everything away. "I ask your permission," he said, "to speak to you privately before we leave this evening." It was not a declaration. It was a question, asked in a room where the asking was itself the declaration. She felt the room attending. She felt the Dowager Countess across the room, not moving. "You have it," she said. The room exhaled. Mrs. Penfold's fan paused. Lady Carne lowered her glass. The room's attention pivoted in that slow, collective way it had, like a tide turning, and Marianne stood at the center of it without flinching, which was the only thing she had ever known how to do in a room like this, and found that it cost her less than it had. The Dowager Countess came to stand beside her after Edmund had returned to the Falmouth Harbor Commissioner for the necessary departure courtesies. She stood beside Marianne and looked at the room with the gray eyes Edmund had inherited. "You will not be comfortable," the Dowager Countess said at last. "People do not forget quickly." "No," Marianne agreed. "But they do forget," the Dowager Countess said. This was not an endorsement. Marianne understood that it was something more complicated than an endorsement, and more valuable than approval. It was a woman who had been right about most things for 40 years, making room, just barely, for the possibility that she was not entirely right about this one. "Thank you," Marianne said. "Do not thank me," the Dowager Countess said. "He is still going to need someone with a great deal of patience." "I have," Marianne said, "a considerable amount of patience." The Dowager Countess looked at her, and something in her face, the careful, contained face that Edmund had learned his expression from, settled into something that was almost peace. "Yes," she said. "I rather think you do." Edmund found her in the small anteroom off the Hadwicks' Hall after the drawing room had dispersed and the carriages were being called. He had the Northern Survey under his arm still, which was not how one ordinarily called on a woman one intended to make an offer to, and she found that she was glad of this, glad that the survey was there and the broken hinge writing desk was in the cottage on Tanner's Row, and all the facts of her situation were known, and there was nothing left to manage. He said, without preamble, "I do not do this well. I have been told by fellows and by my mother, and by approximately 6 months of my own observation, that I do not offer comfort or warmth or any of the things a woman should reasonably expect from a man who intends to spend the rest of his life in her company. I want you to know this before I say anything else." She looked at him. "You held a stranger's coat in the rain," she said, "so she would not have to retrieve it from the cobblestones." He looked at her. "That is not a very high standard." "No," she said, "but it was very wet." This was the thing that was almost a smile again, except this time it arrived all the way, quiet and certain and entirely his own, and she felt it in the center of her chest like a coal catching, like a room warming for the first time after a long winter. He said, "Will you allow me to call on you?" She said, "You have already called on me." He said, "Properly, with regularity, in the manner that signifies." She said, with the honesty she had found, this past year, was the only currency she had left, and the only one worth having. "Yes, I will allow that." He did not take her hand. He looked at it, where the ring sat, and did not make a speech, because she had just told him he could call on her, and that was enough for one evening. He was a man who understood what was enough. That was, she thought, perhaps the rarest quality she had encountered in a man. He said, "Good night, Marianne," and left. She stood in the Hadwicks' anteroom with the hall candles burning low and the sound of carriages in the yard, and her breath coming evenly, just evenly, which it had not quite done in a drawing room for a year, and thought that this was what it felt like. to be seen by someone who was not looking for something to manage. In April, the Renmore solicitor resolved what remained of Clement's outstanding obligations with the 3 creditors, which Edmund had addressed without informing Marianne in advance, because he knew she would refuse if he asked. She did not refuse once it was done. She sat in the single good chair and looked at the watercolor of Falmouth Harbor for a long time. When he came to call the following afternoon, she said, "The solicitor's visit was not necessary." He said, "It was not possible to court you properly with a creditor still calling." She said, "That is very practical." He said, "I am a practical man." She looked at him. "You are not only a practical man," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "No, not only." She moved the ring that afternoon from her right hand to a chain she found in the writing desk, and wore it at her throat for the 6 months of courtship that followed, which contained enough dinners and morning calls and rides along the Falmouth coastal road to satisfy even the county's appetite for visible evidence. The Dowager Countess attended the wedding in September with the expression of a woman who has adjusted her position on a matter of substance. Mrs. Penfold sent a note of felicitation. Lady Carne had removed herself to Bath for the autumn. The wedding was small, which was also what Marianne wanted, which Edmund had somehow known without being told. In the evening of their first day at Renmore, she found the drawer in his writing desk. Not by searching for it, by being in the study while he dealt with a letter from Fellows regarding the spring planting, and noticing the drawer, and understanding what was in it. From the way he did not open it, she did not ask about it. She sat in the chair near the window and looked at the early autumn light on the Renmore grounds, the gray stone house and the grounds going gold in the September evening, and thought about all the things they had not yet told each other and all the time ahead in which to say them. The ring was still on its chain. She had not yet decided where to put it. Edmund finished with Fellows's letter and came to sit beside her, close enough that his shoulder was near hers, and they sat like that in the last of the evening light without speaking, which was not silence so long as both of them were in it. After a time he said, "The letter is in the second drawer." She said, "Yes." "I do not know what to do with it," he said. "You do not have to decide tonight," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. She looked back at him. The room held the last of the September light, and the study smelled of paper and old leather, and the specific quality of a room that had contained grief for 2 years and was now, by slow degrees, becoming something else. She took the ring from its chain and looked at it in her palm. Worn smooth on one side, the size of someone else's hand. "I'm going to put this away," she said. "Not because I'm done with what it means, because I think I may be done carrying it." He looked at the ring. Then he looked at her hand, the hand that had held it, and then he covered her hand with his own, and she felt the warmth of it, steady and without performance. The warmth of a man who had understood from the beginning that some things must not be rushed. She placed the ring in the small box on the writing desk that held nothing important and had been waiting all this time for something to be put in it. Outside the window, the Renmore grounds went gold, and then amber, and then the quiet, particular dark of a September evening in the county, and the fire lit itself in the grate. And somewhere in the house a clock made its measured sound, and neither of them moved to light the second candle, because neither of them needed it yet. If this story found you, thank you for staying until the end. Leave a note if you know that feeling, the one of setting something down after a long time carrying it. The ring stayed in the box. The drawer in the writing desk stayed closed. In the days that followed, Edmund told her about Aldous, and she listened. And she told him about Clement, and he listened. And none of it was resolved by the telling, because some things are not resolved, only held differently. The holding was what mattered. The watercolor came with her from the cottage on Tanner's Row. It hung in the upstairs sitting room at Wrenmore, the Falmouth harbor in its particular light, beside the window that overlooked the grounds. She left it there,